Okay. 6th of December. This and that. Welcome to This and That. We're going to continue on with the little book launch presentation with uh, Radhika Desai, John Bellamy Foster, and Rockhill, Gabriel Rockhill. And but before that, I wanted to read the review of Losurdo's Western Marxisms that came out in Italy and was reviewed by David Broder in 2017. So the book launches for the English translation. Well, it is, of course, critical in that sense. Leaving through its pages, however, we would be hard pressed to find any trace of calls for Western Marxism's rebirth. Losurdo prefers to assume the stance of a doctor faced with an ailing patient telling the worried relatives why they may as well turn off the life support. The book's combative tone will come as no surprise to readers of Losurdo's work so far available in English, and it extends from a book on Heidegger and the ideology of war, Hegel and the freedom of the moderns, and it ranges to liberalism, a counter history, war and revolution, rethinking the 20th century, and nonviolence, a history beyond the myth, with, of course, an intellectual biography of Nietzsche due to appear early next year. I better find that. And of course, our friend Henry did the translation of Losurdo's book on Stalin, which had the usual reaction to it, of course. These form only a small part of Losurdo's prodigious output in his native language. It comprises some 35 books and numerous co-authored volumes, making him one of the most prolific Italian thinkers of his generation. And needless to say, in Urbino, it's as important as any. Born in 1941 near Bari, he belongs to the generation radicalized in the 60s when he was a young, youthful militant in the small wing of Italian communism that rallied to Chinese positions in the Sino-Soviet dispute and hailed the Cultural Revolution before splitting into different groups that faded away after the death of Mao in 1976. In the 80s, he was a contributor to the pages of PCI's daily Lunita and became a member of that party, PCI. It abandoned its name in 1991. He threw in his lot with those who left to create the Rifondazione Comunista, which in turn reduced to a wraith after its participation in the Prodi government of 2006-2008. And since 2016, in his later last years, he joined the attempt to recreate a second PCI under the party's old name, an organization currently claiming some 12,000 members. And needless to say, these breaks are important breaks in the usual kind of internecine communist stuff, particularly in Italy. Il Marxismo Occidentale offers without question an original construction of its subject. Losurdo's key move is to contrast Western Marxism systematically with an Eastern Marxism presented as its productive antithesis. The Western variant, Losurdo agrees with other accounts, was born out of reaction against the slaughter of the First World War and the magnetism of the revolution in Russia. The outlook of its earliest thinkers, Bloch, Lukács, Benjamin, was, however, from the outset impregnated with a set of themes that went back to the anarchism of Bakunin's time. Notably, a hostility to science associated with capitalism and to the state of any kind associated with tyranny. To these, it added a messianic streak of eschatological expectation inherited from a Judeo-Christian past that looked forward to salvation for humanity in communism, and the state would disappear. Such utopian hopes vested in a beleaguered USSR were bound to be disappointed. The Western Marxism they generated, unable to come to terms with the reality of building a state capable of withstanding the pressures of imperialism, was condemned to impotence and involution. The ensuing theoretical and political blindness had its roots in the formative reaction of the generation of 1914 to the catastrophe of the Great War itself, which instilled in them a detestation of nationalism, held responsible for the mutual massacre of the peoples of Europe, an aversion to technology which had enabled killing on an industrial scale, and a simplistic belief that the path to socialism could therefore come from class struggle alone. The outlook of what crystallized as Eastern Marxism after the October Revolution was altogether distinct. In Europe, the collapse of the masses into chauvinism, social democracy's betrayal on 4 August, and the splintering of the Second International led Western Marxists to see the Russian Revolution as the antidote to this scourge and to hope for a general overcoming of social patriotism with a rapid spread of proletarian revolution across the continent. Even when this failed to materialize, the European left remained imbued with a strong anti-materialist and, in Losurdo's term, anarchoid contempt for the nation. In Asia, on the other hand, World War I was not the unique cataclysm it was in Europe for Chinese or Vietnamese revolutionaries. As Ho Chi Minh pointed out, colonial bloodletting had long predated 1914. If anything, the Great War had actually weakened the grip of European empires on the peoples of Asia. For them, the appeal of the Russian Revolution lay not in the image of an anti-war or anti-national revolt, but on the contrary, in its national inspiration for an anti-imperialist struggle. In 1919 to 21, the Bolshevik-led state had proved able, through its own resources, to free itself from the imperialist powers who attempted to subdue it. It was this that allowed the Soviet Union and the new Communist International to win not only the legions of Ho Chi Minh, who explained that what first drove me to believe in Lenin and the Third International was not communism but patriotism, but even the favor of non-Marxist yet anti-colonial militants such as Sun Yat-sen. So too, for Eastern Marxism, there could be no question of any hostility to science or to the state. Asian struggles for national liberation urgently required the use of science to build both a modern economy capable of lifting the masses from misery and a strong state able to defend the independence of the nation from foreign attack. Eastern Marxists had no illusion that a socialist revolution could deliver all this overnight. Far more people had died during the Taiping Rebellion in China than on all sides of the Great War in Europe, inoculating revolutionaries against any such messianism and preparing them in advance for decades of the harshest struggle, first to win power and then to consolidate it with the creation of a powerful state capable of fending off imperialist counter-revolution. In Russia, the Bolsheviks were initially infused with still greater political expectancy than Marxists in the West, believing that they were merely erecting a bridgehead for revolution in the advanced industrial societies of Europe, and even briefly experimenting with a barter economy under war communism. But sobriety soon prevailed, as the hard task of building socialism in one country with maximum use of scientific knowledge and modern technology to develop the economy and arm the state against invasion took over. This was a fundamental alteration. But if the needle of the compass could swing as it did, it was because Lenin had insisted throughout his career, and even more sharply during the First World War, that revolutions of national liberation in colonized countries were inseparable from those against capital in colonial states. As early as 1913, he was writing of backward Europe and advanced Asia. When the Second World War began and Operation Barbarossa launched Hitler's bid to enslave the peoples of the USSR, the battles to defeat the Wehrmacht in Russia and the Imperial Army in China resulted in victory for the Red Army and the PLA over the colonizing assaults of Germany and Japan. With this epical development, Western Marxism, a left-wing sensibility born of the failure of revolution to spread across Europe after 1917, never came to terms. Defeats in Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Austria impacted not socialism in one country, which continued to build up its strength in Russia, but European currents now detached from any real process of construction. The Soviet experience initiated a worldwide anti-colonial revolution, while Eurocentric tendencies became marginalized. Where the Eastern Marxists took seriously the problems of building socialist states and defending them militarily, their counterparts in the West could at most appreciate revolutionary experiences in a messianic mood, supporting Eastern revolutions at their initial moment of seizing power, then finding distasteful the decisions necessary to protect them from internal subversion and foreign attack, those poor Mensheviks. Judging the real achievements of the Soviet Union by an unfair standard that lay beyond the material possibilities of the time, they then failed to see that rather than being an embodiment of their own visions of a grand resolution of all differences, the Soviet Union was bedeviled by poverty, the masses' low cultural level, and the difficult tasks of stabilizing itself in the face of foreign encirclement. Utopian hopes nowhere realized soon collapsed into claims of dystopia, charges of totalitarianism, epitomizing the divorce of Western Marxists from ongoing historical processes and complacent basking in assurance of the cultural superiority of their own societies. What they could never grasp is that the objective developments of world history had perforce given priority to anti-imperialist over anti-capitalist struggles, national over class contradictions, even if these fused wherever communist parties gained leadership of the cause. In Europe, one outstanding figure alone understood the significance of the anti-colonial revolutions. That was Palmiro Togliatti in Italy. By contrast, the record of Western Marxism became one of continuing ignorance, indifference, or dismissal of the monumentous transformations of the world outside Europe, culminating in the 21st century in outright approval of imperialist interventions to set the clock back in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And the rest of the review is at New Left Review. You know, it's useful, it's important, surprising that not enough people read that review before writing their own reviews of the English translation that has just come out. We may start reading it. It is a little long in the sense that it is a fairly complete history of, at least from the Italian point of view, Western Marxism. So we will think on that. But until then, let us look at the third of three commentaries that occurred during the book drop that I began yesterday. And this is Gabriel Rockhill.
This is a fault that I place with Western Marxism. They have steered us in the wrong direction. And so we nowadays know more about Hegel, and I think Hegel is superior to a lot of the Western Marxist work, that he doesn't have some of these problems, but we know more about Hegel in some ways than we know about Marx within the Western Marxist tradition, and that's really a tragedy along with all the rest. So I believe, as Radhika says, in the rebirth of Western Marxism, but not as Western Marxism, as a component of global Marxism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Now we're going to hear from Gabriel Rockhill. He is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop, professor of philosophy, and associate director of the Cultural Studies program at Villanova University, and research associate at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. Gabriel has published 10 books, including most recently Requiem for French Theory, written with Améric Monville. He is currently completing Who Paid the Piper of Western Marxism, the first volume in The Intellectual World War, a trilogy of books that is under contract with Monthly Review Press. Gabriel is co-editor of the World Marxist Review and of the Anti-Imperialist Marxism book series, and his more public-facing writings can be found in venues like Monthly Review, LA Review of Books, New York Times, and Counterpunch. Gabriel?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, John and Radhika. I should say to start with that it's a real honor to participate in this panel with both of you, because I think that you are some of the most important Marxists working in the Western world, and it's wonderful to have your historical perspective and your kind of learned overview concerning these complex histories. It's also an honor to have the Critical Theory Workshop collaborate with the International Manifesto Group and Monthly Review. In my comments today, I thought that in the interest of time, because I co-authored the introduction with Jennifer, I've also had a number of opportunities to publicly talk about the book through a series of launches, that what I should do is instead focus on what I see as elements within Losurdo's work that I've been developing in dialogue with a number of other scholars, particularly in the works that Jennifer mentioned, the book with Émeric Monville and the forthcoming projects from Monthly Review. Because one of the undertakings in this book draws precisely on the importance of understanding Western Marxism as, in part, a product of the imperial superstructure. What I mean by the imperial superstructure is the institutionalized ideological framework that has been developed in the world's leading imperialist power, the United States, and has at least partially been globalized through cultural imperialism. The superstructure, as Marx explained, is composed of two components. There's a political-legal apparatus that's centered in the bourgeois state, as well as a cultural apparatus, meaning this is not his vocabulary, but I think it sums up what it was that he was talking about. There's an entire system of production, circulation, and consumption of culture in the broadest sense of this term, right? So it includes religion, culture, philosophy, the arts, etc. And this cultural apparatus is made up of all of the social institutions that regulate the production and dissemination of culture, including the educational system, religious institutions, culture industries, and much more. Now, the reason I think it is important to approach the issue of Western Marxism from the vantage point of an analysis of the imperial superstructure is that it allows us to develop a systemic account of the fundamental forces driving it, rather than slipping into an idiosyncratic analysis that assumes, for instance, that Western Marxism is simply the result of the aggregated contributions of individual thinkers who were autonomously coming up with projects, and those projects succeeded in the so-called marketplace of ideas. Instead, this more systemic approach sheds light on the concrete linkages between the economic base and the ideological superstructure, while avoiding all forms of reification and reductionism, meaning that it's important as well to pay ample attention to the subjective agency of individual intellectuals, but also always situating them within the broader world in which their agency is exercised, meaning within the objective social totality. It's precisely by foregrounding this dialectical play of forces between the objective elements of their material context and the imperial superstructure more specifically, and the subjective agency of intellectuals on the other hand, that you can really bring into relief the phenomenon known as Western Marxism. And I think both Radhika and John highlighted some good examples of the ways in which there were, acts or writings on the part of particular individuals that didn't really fit within the overall structure of Western Marxism, precisely by getting clear on both these individual subjective agencies and then the overall system of cultural production that I think we can shed the best possible light on this phenomenon of Western Marxism. Now, one important aspect of this, and this overlaps particularly with John's comments, is that much of what is referred to as Western Marxism is a product very specifically of the theory industry, and the imperial theory industry more specifically, right? We're talking about those who are within a kind of philosophic and theoretical realm, much more so than a lot of the social scientists who have worked in the kind of modern Western world. Now, Marxism, I think, historically has tended to have wide public appeal due to its clear explanatory and transformative power, and it has not been possible to simply eradicate it, including within the imperial core. And this has created a problem for the owners of the means of intellectual production and those who manage their interests. And that is, well, how can you deal with the fact that you can't simply eradicate Marxism? And I think the principal solution to that has been to try to foster, through various means, many of them economic, the development of a version of Marxism that is ultimately compatible with capitalist interests. It's a version of Marxism that tends to condemn actually existing socialism, often in the strongest possible terms. And as critical as it may sometimes be of capitalism, it traffics in capitalist accommodationism and sometimes openly supports imperialism. Since it is known that the capitalist ruling class and its managers have a history of supporting what they call the compatible left, meaning compatible with capitalism, we might call this version of Marxism compatible Marxism, or Marxism compatible with the agenda of the capitalist ruling class in the West, or in the imperial core. Consider a few statements. Quote, "The failure of all socialist and communist experiences in the last century had as its consequences that we do not have today a great and clear idea of another world." End quote. Communism, this is another quote, and more specifically Stalinism, is maybe the worst ideological, political, ethical, social catastrophe in the history of humanity. Yet another quote, "Socialism and capitalism never were opposites, but rather, as many critical analysts of the Soviet Union claimed, socialism is a regime for the state management of capitalist production." End quote. These are all authors who figure very prominently in the Verso book publication entitled The Idea of Communism. There, Alain Badiou was the first quote, Slavoj Žižek was the second, and the third was Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. These are the leading luminaries of Western Marxism today. We see here clearly that the idea of communism for these Western Marxists stands in the starkest possible contrast to the practice. So Western Marxism, I think, needs to be understood as a broader ideological project of radical recuperation. It waves the red flag of Marxism, and it often claims to be the most authentic, rigorous, and advanced form thereof, thereby revealing its social chauvinism, or what John was referring to as Eurocentrism. However, its fundamental function within the broader social world and class struggle is to recuperate potentially insurgent forces within, at a minimum, an anti-communist worldview, though often one that also directly segues with capitalist and imperialist interests. The Western Marxists thereby play the ideological role of radical recuperators. We should, of course, be attentive to the dialectical nature of this attempted unity of opposites between radical politics on the one hand and capitalist recuperation on the other. It is indeed the case that many Western Marxists have spread some knowledge that can be useful regarding how capitalism functions and important critiques thereof. It is possible to learn things from them. However, their ultimate ideological orientation and contribution need to be situated within the social totality and more specifically the imperial superstructure. The bourgeois cultural apparatus and elements of the bourgeois state have promoted their work as the most cutting-edge form of Marxist theory precisely because it is explicitly opposed to the practical undertaking of breaking the chains of imperialism and building socialism in the real world. The dialectical relationship between the forces of the imperial superstructure and the agency of the most prominent Western Marxists therefore needs to be elucidated. Rather than simply being an accidental convergence, there is a very coherent and systemic relationship that becomes visible as soon as we engage in dialectical materialist analysis. These are subjects, intellectuals, who give to the system of imperial knowledge production what it demands in order to receive uplift in return. So Western Marxism could be described more precisely as imperial Marxism, in the sense that it is the type of Marxism fostered by the imperial core and within its theory industry, while being one that tends to accommodate this Marxism and even in certain instances celebrate imperialism. This version of Marxism is, moreover, a commodified form of Marxism. It has enormous exchange value within the imperial professional managerial class stratum, but little to no use value for the struggle against imperialism and socialism. To shed a little more light on this political economy driving Western Marxism as a product of the imperial theory industry, it's important to note that it has been widely supported and promoted within the major industries of capitalist cultural production, including universities, publishing houses, the art and cultural world, etc. Moreover, the capitalist ruling class and the bourgeois state have also been directly involved in promoting it in various ways. So in the interest of is widely considered to be one of the principal contributors to Western Marxism. It's important to know that during their wartime and immediate post-war exile in the United States, the majority of the associates of the Frankfurt School, 7 of them, were not employed as professors or full-time researchers with the Institute for Social Research. Instead, they were in the employ of the US government, working for a combined total of 50+ years in various state agencies, including the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, the State Department, and propaganda agencies like the Office of War Information and Voice of America. They were thus intellectuals and purported Marxists who labored in the service of the capitalist state that would emerge from the war as the leading imperialist power. They formed a veritable Washington School at the time, and their governmental work, their service to empire, was in many ways their career springboard because it launched them into prestigious positions in the academy, including at Harvard, Columbia, Berkeley, Stanford, and other major institutions. In other words, serving as the Washington School helped make the Frankfurt School into what is arguably the most internationally renowned school of Western Marxism. I hope we all see the contradiction here. The leading school of Western Marxism cut its teeth not by fighting imperialism, but by serving the world's emerging leading imperialist state. Now, this is not to deny, and I must insist on this point, that there are not some intricacies, contradictions, and nuances to these histories that I'm setting aside in the interest of space, and I'd be happy to discuss these in the Q&A. I just want to highlight the one element of that specific relationship. Moreover, the capitalist ruling class of this same imperialist state, the United States, has been directly involved in funding and promoting the Frankfurt School. The Rockefeller robber barons were the leaders, providing numerous collective and individual grants. John, of course, alluded to this. But one of their projects was entitled the Marxism-Leninism Project. Rockefeller invested the equivalent today of approximately $1.7 million in this project up to 1960. It financed a global network of institutions, established international research groups, funded 9 global conferences, supported scholarly exchanges and meetings, set up a research program in New York, supported dissertations, funded numerous publication projects, one of whose goals was to make purportedly authentic versions of Marxist texts available that had not been perverted by Moscow's influence. It also set up a collaborative network between participating institutions across Europe, whose backbone was formed out of the Eastern European Institutes of the Free University in Berlin, the Amsterdam International Institute for Social History, and the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. In short, the Rockefeller Foundation established an expansive, well-funded, international material system of knowledge production, distribution, and consumption, whose explicit objective was to wage doctrinal warfare on Marxism-Leninism in favor of promoting and supporting Western Marxism. Since I was just in the Rockefeller Center archive unearthing additional details concerning this project, I should note that this was only one small endeavor situated within an extremely vast undertaking of intellectual imperialism and neocolonialism that consisted in funding the development of powerful knowledge networks across Western Europe that would serve US interests. In France, for instance, the principal institutional stronghold for both structuralism and the Annales School was funded by the same capitalist interests and was part of the same overall project. Both of these traditions, structuralism, French structuralism, and the Annales School, were recognized by the US state as making major contributions to anti-communist research. At the center of the Rockefeller's Marxism-Leninism project was Herbert Marcuse. At the request of his close personal friend, who was one of his greatest academic supporters, a man by the name of Philip Mosley, Marcuse was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation to spend a long sojourn in Paris at the structuralist stronghold that I just mentioned, and he was entrusted with the mission of drawing, this is a quote, drawing the Marxists among them, which he knew full well about because he corresponded about this, and it was part of the reason he received this particular grant, although he received a lot of other funding from the Rockefellers as well. And this was in order to convert Marxists in the West to Western Marxism. I mentioned that this was at the behest of his friend and supporter, Philip Mosley, in part because Mosley was a long-time, top-level CIA consultant with a clearance of the security level top secret. The US state was working hand in glove with the capitalist ruling class, as well as the institutions of the cultural apparatus, in waging an intellectual world war on anti-imperialist Marxism. Although Marcuse disingenuously misrepresented his government work in later interviews, the archival record is clear. Marcuse worked closely with the Central Intelligence Agency, and he even had a hand in writing national intelligence estimates, which are the highest form of national intelligence. This was his springboard into the academic world, and his first positions were at CIA cutouts in the academy, the Russian Institute at Columbia and the Russian Research Center at Harvard. Marcuse was, at least in his early career and during his rise to fame, a Western Marxist who worked in the service of empire. None of this, I should note, negates what John had highlighted about Marcuse's radicalization and the important contradictions in the history of his life and work, because he did come out as a strong supporter for certain forms of anti-imperialist struggle, as well as the Black liberation struggle, the women's struggle, the ecological struggle, and other such things. So as dialectical analysts, we have to be able to engage in, a fine-grained assessment. Nevertheless, and these are my concluding remarks, we see here then that Western Marxism is not just an organic outgrowth of the imperial superstructure. It has been directly fashioned and promoted by the world's leading imperialist state and its capitalist ruling class. This should give us a very clear sense of its purpose, which is to denigrate, destroy, and sideline anti-imperialist Marxism, global Marxism, international Marxism, we could use other terms for this, while replacing that form of Marxism, or just universal Marxism, replacing it with a propagandistic, commercialized version of Marxism, intent on convincing readers that imperialism is not the fundamental problem, and that real world socialism is not the solution. Thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Gabriel. So now we are going to have an opportunity for the speakers to add some additional comments. And meanwhile, those in the audience, if you have questions, it's a good time to start thinking about them, putting those in the chat, because we'll open up for questions after the speakers can each respond. We'll start with you, Radhika. Oh, you're unmuted.
Okay, so I'm just absolutely fascinated by John and Gabriel's discussions, and gosh, there's so many things to say, but in general, I found them very interesting and absorbing. And one, I'll go with Gabriel first, and then John, since Gabriel spoke most recently. I mean, one of the things I've often puzzled about, and I'd love to know the views of others on this, is, why is it that people who are actually quite conservative in reality want to pose as Marxists? Like, what's in it? What's the deal? Why do they want to pose as Marxists? Obviously, one is that by posing as Marxists, they muddy the waters, they etc. But nevertheless, I'd love to hear if there's anything I'm missing here. Obviously, again, the combination of the complete misunderstanding and, generally speaking, the failure to even mention the reality of imperialism, or the deliberate obfuscation of the reality of imperialism or evasion of it, is again part of this general understanding that I feel is part of Western Marxism, although I take the strictures that I think, John, you laid out very well, that, Western Marxism is probably a more problematic category than certainly I was making it out to be. But having accepted those, let me just say that there is this conception of Western Marxism, that at least that is there in Losurdo, that I broadly agree with. it combines the condemnation of actually existing socialism with a complete failure to comprehend the reality of not just not the reality so much as the necessity of imperialism to capitalism. And so what that then does is it recuperates capitalism, and the principal fashion in which capitalism is recuperated today is something that Gabriel, you were touching on, and that is what I call neo-Proudhonism. That is to say, the idea that capitalism is only about markets and competition and small enterprises and so on, and completely neglecting the fact that, as Marx anticipated already before he died, that capitalism was moving to a monopoly phase, that once it was at its monopoly phase, it was basically past its sell-by date, that it had to, it will be ripe for conversion into socialism, etc. And by the way, Lenin in particular, in his Imperialism, refers to this idea repeatedly. He goes back to it so often. It's incredible. But anyway, so this neo-Proudhonism emerges to kind of make it out as if capitalism can be retained. But of course, if you accept their arguments and follow up their policy consequences, what is maintained is, of course, this current, what I call senile monopoly capitalism. Further, I mean, I was intrigued, Gabriel, by your tendency to distinguish between the theory industry and the social sciences. So if you could say something more, we can have a discussion about it, because I personally feel I have a bigger critique of the modern social sciences, which I think would be interesting to go into if you like. I loved your idea of the imperial superstructure, really good idea, and the general systematic way of understanding the production, circulation, and distribution of culture. Great. For John, I just want to make two comments and then leave it at that. So the first is that I think the ideological and Eurocentric regression or deviations, or whatever you want to call them, distortions, are linked. So if you, on the one hand, have the abandonment of the material dimension, that material dimension includes imperialism, as I would like to urge you all to understand, is that it includes imperialism because, of course, it is rooted in the contradictions of capitalism. It is not optional for capitalism. It is necessary for capitalism. It must happen if capitalism is to survive. And part of the reason capitalism is in crisis today is because we are living in a time when an increasing number of countries are able to deny to the homelands of capitalism, to the metropoles, as we might say, imperial privileges, which they have hitherto had. Part of this potential of denial of this has always been there, and we have been through a similar crisis before. And to me, the resurgence of inflation in particular is a very important sign of this, or a symptom of this, because the suppression of inflation has historically relied on the metropoles being able to access the products of third world labor for next to nothing. And when that ability goes, then you get inflation. You got that in the 70s, and then that crisis was temporarily resolved, but it has resurged once again. So so to me, that idealist and Eurocentric regressions are linked. And then the second is that, of course, I'm very, to some extent, I'm fairly familiar, let me put it that way, with this whole critique, the Brenner critique of the monthly review school and the whole back and forth and so on. So to me, the Western Marxist emphasis, or the what we call political Marxist emphasis on the relations of production, and the Smithian Marxist view, which, whatever else you may fault it for, has had the honorable tradition of always emphasizing imperialism. These two traditions can be reconciled in what I'm calling geopolitical economy, precisely because it overcomes a critical theoretical lacuna, which is actually, in my humble opinion, shared by both. That is to say, the inability to root imperialism in the contradictions of capitalism because of this history of the policy of theoretical reconciliation with neoclassical economics. And if we could reconcile that, we could actually create a theoretical understanding that unites the working class struggle around the world with the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle around the world into and they're not the same, but they are very deeply connected, they're very deeply related, and they are both necessary to lead to socialism. So I think we could do something like that. So I will just say those things right now and leave it at that. Oh, and I have, sorry, one further question. I would love John to reflect after having read Losurdo's book, why he doesn't mention, I mean, I agreed with so many of your comments. So why doesn't Losurdo mention the monthly review tradition at all? So, because I don't think he mentions it, but yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Thank you, Radhika. I'll turn it over to you, John.
Well, Losurdo doesn't mention the monthly review tradition because he basically falls into the trap of following Anderson's book and letting Anderson's demarcation basically define his own efforts, counter efforts. But Anderson excluded political economy very effectively. If you look at the footnotes, he excluded, let's say, Paul Sweezy, he excluded E.P. Thompson, he excluded all of the thinkers of, all the political economic thinkers, all the natural scientists, all the materialists. He found ways to exclude them from his analysis. And Losurdo just basically deals with the thinkers that Anderson deals with. So he it's partly the way his project was defined in this book. So he doesn't confront the fact that the most prominent theories of imperialism, the ones that, in the post-Second World War period, were all developed, Marxist theories of imperialism were all developed by Western thinkers. And so that's a complicated thing. Western thinkers who were allied with the global South. And so that's a weakness of the analysis, but one can't do everything. I was a little perplexed by your comments, Radhika, because when you said that the idealistic regression and the Eurocentric regression were connected, I thought that was what I was saying. I think you were thinking you were differing with me, and I must not have been clear. I was saying the important thing is that Losurdo connected these. How do we understand the relationship? Why does the idealistic regression promote the Eurocentric regression and vice versa? Why are they linked? And that was really the nature of what I was trying to convey, which clearly I didn't convey well enough. In terms of the Brenner critique of Smithian Marxism, haven't heard that for a long time, but I thought that, Brenner was totally off the wall, and and I can't go into all of this, but the thing is that you say, well, the monthly review tradition was unable to root imperialism and capitalist political economy. Well, we're talking about all the major theorists of imperialism in the Second World War period, which were all attached to monthly review. You're talking about Paul Baran and Sweezy, Andre Gunder Frank. They all had weaknesses. Frank's approach was quite weak. And you're talking about Samir Amin, you're talking about world systems theory, unequal exchange theory. I think that all of these traditions actually grew out of the classical theory of imperialism. And for monthly review, Lenin's theory of imperialism is still the foundation for the entire analysis. And our understanding is imperialism developed out of monopoly capitalism, or monopoly capitalism is imperialism. So I don't really see how your criticism applies, and unless you're adopting Brenner's interpretation as correct, which I thought was, it's nonsense on stilts, as Jeremy Bentham once said. It has nothing to do. It was that whole argument that, oh, these guys deal with exchange, so they can't have anything to do with production, which is absolutely absurd. And if you approach questions of imperialism that way, it just becomes an apologetics, which was what Brenner was part of, the rejection of imperialism theory. And that's exactly why he was attacking Monthly Review, but because a Monthly Review is, I mean, it's basically has been the center of imperialism theory in North America, at least, and linked to the global South throughout our history. And so I don't think we have any disagreements. I just think that maybe you think that we're in disagreement when we're not. And I personally agree with everything you said. So, and I have nothing to challenge you on. It was very good. And Gabriel, there were just a couple of small points I wanted to raise because I agree with your whole argument. And when I referred to the Adorno and Horkheimer being divided back into West Germany as by the U.S. authorities and actually paid by them. This is part of that whole process, and you and I have talked about it. I mean, but this is something that has not been talked about, the objective circumstances of all of this. One place where I have questions is in the Office of Strategic Services. It's true that it turned into the CIA eventually. I mean, it was later converted into the CIA, but the Office of Strategic Services, which arose in the Second World War, there were all sorts of people involved in that on the left, who is part of the anti-Nazi war. And the Office of Strategic Services was really crucial in that. So people like Paul Sweezy, more indirectly Paul Braun, Franz Neumann, a lot of really important figures, that had, of course, connections to the Frankfurt School, like Braun and so on. But a lot of them were involved in the Office of Strategic Services, and in Braun's case, the Strategic Bombing Survey. This was part of the war effort in the case of Nazi Germany. And Sweezy, our author, was the editor of the European Political Report, which provided a historical materialist analysis. Although it was funded by the government, it provided a historical materialist analysis that's notable of everything that was happening during the war. And so a lot of them were involved in sincerely fighting Nazism. But the difference with Marcuse is that he didn't leave the government security establishment right away. He entered the Office of Intelligence Services, or an Office of Intelligence Research, and his Soviet Marxism was based on a critique of the Soviet Union, a very one-sided critique of the Soviet Union that he did for U.S. intelligence, and then he made it into a book. So I said that Losurdo went overboard in his criticism of Marcuse, and I think that in a way that's true, because he cites all these things that Marcuse said against imperialism, and then just sort of says he didn't do enough. But his argument there in his book is not convincing. Your argument is convincing. I mean, I think that the things that you are doing are necessary in order to really bring Losurdo's work to fruition. He wasn't able to do the kind of objective analysis in terms of the objective conditions that you're now doing. And I was introduced to some of this by Mazuros, who was very critical of Adorno and Horkheimer, and in Month Review there also was, Paul Baran was very critical of Adorno and Horkheimer and what they were doing. So we had this kind of internal critique that's very important, and some of these objective relations were known, but in the background, but they've been held in the background, and now thanks to your work, they're coming out, and I think this is incredibly important if we're going to straighten out this mess and move away from a Eurocentric Western Marxism toward what I would say is a global Marxism. Marxism is global. It isn't Western or Eastern. It stands with all of humanity, or all of oppressed humanity, and we can't divide it into hemispheres or simply geopolitical blocks. The main problem is the capitalist core, which is still located in the West, and it's still the same dominant 6 or 7 imperial powers. The same ones as in Lenin's day are the ones that we really have to confront today.
Thank you, John. Gabriel?
I thought those were some wonderful comments. I'll just pick up on a few of the threads. One thing that I really appreciated that both Radhika and John brought to the fore is the question of dialectics and contradictions. And Radhika in particular, you insisted on there being a kind of Marxism without contradictions. And what could that possibly mean? Because ultimately you're getting rid of the contradictions of imperialism and in certain cases, even just class struggle, right? And so I think centering that and really teasing out the meanings of that, because for some people they might react and say, well, no, there is a lot of dialectics in Western Marxism, but that type of dialectics is like what Lenin called a toy rattle, right? It's a rhetorical stratagem where you say it's like this, it might be like that, it might be the opposite, we can go back and forth, but it spins in the void. John, I love the sentence that you used where you said that dialectics is a constant circle of reification that can't get down to material relations. And so I thought that was also an interesting point of continuity between Radhika's criticisms and John's criticisms, and really that the form of global Marxism or anti-imperialist Marxism that we're talking about is one that is dialectical, but it's a materialist form of dialectics that is paying attention to the kind of specificities of particular conjunctures and particular struggles. And one thing that I did want to highlight, because I think it might be helpful for engaging with Losurdo, is that in this book and in a lot of his other work, I see him as in kind of embodying a dialectical method. He's not giving us an empirical encyclopedia of the totality of Western Marxism. He's not giving us a complete account of each of the figures that he's engaging with. What he's doing is he's taking particular elements of their writings, particular moments of global class struggle, and he's theoretically articulating them at a higher level so that then we can see the relationship between these particular manifestations and a general or universal pattern and structure, if you will, which doesn't mean that then every single instance correlates to that pattern. But what it does mean, it's almost like a constellational approach, that the particular, it's very Hegelian, is the manifestation of the universal, or that the general structure only manifests itself in these particular instances. And I think it's a very interesting form of dialectical materialist methodology that he's marshaling. And so I just wanted to float that out as a kind of topic of conversation because it seems like it overlaps with what everyone was talking about. Maybe just going relatively quickly through some of the other issues. Radhika, on the theory industry, I reference that because I do think that in a certain sense, the danger of Western Marxism principally is when it becomes extra-disciplinary and it grips the masses because it saturates into the activist and organizing world. And that, someone's work like, I don't know, Hart and Negri or Badiou, this is work that a lot of people in a lot of disciplines feel like they have to be familiar with, and it does saturate a lot of activist circles. in the way that some, Marxist social scientific research does not. But I think you raise a fundamental point, and it would be great to have follow-up conversations about that, is the effects on the social sciences, and very specifically the bourgeois social sciences, how they've operated historically and institutionally. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on those specific criticisms. The question concerning why do certain intellectuals pose as Marxists, I do see this in terms of the class standing of a lot of the intellectuals in the imperial core who are in the academy. And that is that if you're in the professional managerial class stratum, your manifesto actually for the IMG talks about this very specifically, you're working for the bourgeoisie or the owners of the means of production, but you're situated between them and the general working class. And many of that middle layer will be like the Fukuyamas and the Huntingtons and the Snyders and other people today, who they're just pitching to the capitalist ruling class and they're shoring up the dominant ideology. But there's also another orientation, and that is those in this middle layer who want to appear like they're on the side of the people, but have no material interest and no real dedication to transforming the structures of power that keep the people below them. And so there's a kind of posturing that often occurs in the left wing of the professional managerial class stratum, where you want to appear radical, but you really don't want anything to change. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe just touching on, oh, and actually, I'll just give a shout out. Radhika has an excellent piece on the kind of neo-Proudhonianism of Badiou and some of these other figures, because there's a strong anarchist tendency in a lot of this work that we haven't really touched on, but I thought I'd at least mention in passing. Yes, John, the OSS, you're absolutely right. I have a lot of detailed work on this. It is important that the OSS, the action arm of the OSS, while Marcuse was working in it, was working on projects to sign peace agreements with the Nazis in order to allow there to be peace in the West so that the Nazi genocidal rampage could continue unabated in the East. And that was being done by Alan Dulles, who then would become the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. And then with Operation Sunrise and other activities, they were incorporating the fascists and the Nazis into the Western imperial framework during and immediately after the war. It doesn't mean that Marcuse was doing that or some of these other intellectuals, because there was a compartmentalization in which you had the action arm and the research arm. But it's a kind of much more complex history, and I'll just mention this in passing, but Franz Neumann, from at least what we know from the current archival record, this could change in the future, there are suggestions that he was giving intelligence to the Soviets, including the negotiations on the part of Dulles to sign a peace agreement with the high command of the Nazis just below Hitler. And so it's a much more intricate history. And I'll just leave it at that, because I agree fully with your comments about needing nuance on that front. The last thing that I'll say, and this will be to just open it back up, is I wanted to cycle back to, John made this point as well, but Radhika, you really insisted on, the real question is, well, how do we rejuvenate Marxism, given that we've inherited the kind of scourge of Western Marxism? And I'll just suggest one thing, but I'd be curious thoughts more broadly, is that we have to do this work collectively. It's no individual who's going to solve this problem. And that one of the principal ways that Western Marxism has been so powerful is because it has institutional power. It has the owners and the managers of the means of communication and intellectual production driving it in various ways. And so we need institutional power, and we need to develop and further consolidate, platforms like Monthly Review, International Manifesto Group, Critical Theory Workshop, and others that allow us to create a real community of progressive scholarship, research, and activism in order to kind of socialize this broader struggle for a form of Marxism that is dedicated to the concrete task of dismantling imperialism and moving in a socialist direction. But Jennifer, with those thoughts, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you all so much. We do have some questions in the chat. So maybe I'll start by sharing two of them, and then you guys can respond how you want, and then we can do another round. We have one of the questions asks, to what extent are Trotskyism and left communism part of the Western Marxist tradition that's being diagnosed? And another question asks, do you think that anti-imperialists in the imperial core should use different strategies than anti-imperialists in the global south? And I think you guys can respond to those, either or both of those questions as you'd like.
Well, I don't see Trotskyism as an entirely unified movement. I mean, obviously, the Fourth International, I mean, there is a broad coherence to Trotskyism, but there are a lot of different variants. Perry Anderson, of course, was, who wrote Considerations on Western Marxism, came from the Trotskyist tradition and very much part of that. But he himself excludes a lot of Trotskyists from his Western Marxist category. For example, somebody like Ernst Mandel, who is a very different kind of animal, was but actually a prominent figure, is left out of the analysis. And I could give many other examples. And it wouldn't be correct to say that Trotskyist thinkers simply ignored imperialism, but obviously, being, in the Trotskyist tradition, there was a very strong opposition to Soviet Marxism, particularly, from the 1930s on. So it's a complicated question. I don't think that Trotskyism generally abandoned the dialectics of nature or materialism, but thinkers like Anderson did. And so I would say, it all depends. It's there are many really important Trotskyist thinkers that are critical of these trends, and others maybe who have succumbed to them, and divisions within. And so I would hesitate to criticize on that ground. And in terms of different strategies in the North and the South, well, this is a complicated thing, but obviously the North, I mean, if we follow Lenin on this, that the North has an upper stratum that is part of a labor aristocracy. We can do that look at that in various ways, but there is a part of what we call the working class, upper stratum of the working class, definitely in the North, that has been brought into imperialism. Lenin's answer to that was to dig deeper, to go to the real working class. And but there are, the United States, for example, is the leading imperialist country in the world. It's very reactionary. The role of the primary role of Marxists in the United States is to oppose the U.S. Imperialist machine from within. That is our role, even more than what we would call the class struggle as itself. But we do it from within, which is different and in support of the global South. But in the global South, there are more revolutionary possibilities present. And in terms of, let's say, the environmental problem, the global North is the principal problem in terms of having these ecological footprints that for the United States, if the whole world had ecological footprint of the United States, you'd need 4 planets. And the overshoot of the ecological overshoot in the North has to be reversed, and that requires a reconstitution of society at large. But in terms of, it would have to involve some elements of what we call degrowth. In the global South, it's different. Many of the countries most in the global south are using per capita energy uses way below the global average, below the sustainable level for the planet as a whole. And those countries have to be able to develop. And imperialism is blocking that in various ways. So the strategies are different because we're in different places. But there could be a unity of action in the sense that we have a common cause, which we fight in different ways depending on our positions.
Thank you, Radhika. Gabriel?
So I'll agree with John on what he said about Trotskyism. It's a very wide-ranging phenomenon. A lot of what Trotsky said is worth reading, listening to. I mean, it's, he stands opposed to the mainstream communist tradition in certain ways, but not in others. He was part of it for a very long time, and so I mean, it's Trotskyism is one thing, Trotsky is another thing. I would also, I mean, in terms of anti-imperialism as well, I mean, I think that if one wanted to be very brief, I would say that anti-imperialism begins at home, and people in the West in particular have a special duty to oppose imperialism, which is something that's not happening at the moment because such large parts of the left are being distracted by some of the worst elements of what we are calling Western Marxism today, which have denied imperialism, which have condemned attempts to construct socialism elsewhere as regressive, totalitarian, etc., etc. So all these things are problems, and I would say that in many ways, I often argue that the theory of the three worlds, which often people feel a bit leery about because they think that to call the developing world the third world means that this is like somehow derogatory, that third world means third class. It doesn't mean that. It has historically very different origins, and it was taken up by the third world countries themselves at venues like Bandung and so on. So, I mean, it's different. But I would say that the origin of this tripartite division of the world actually is found, at least as far as I could trace it back, in actually a text of 1916 by Lenin on the self-determination of nations, in which he says, what are the things that people, what should communists do, in the present situation? And he said, well, in the three different parts of the world, there are three different answers. And he says in the imperialist world, obviously, they should oppose imperialism. In that part of the world that was not formally colonized, or that was not colonized generally, in which he includes Eastern Europe and Russia, he says that their aim is to connect their own struggles of the working class with the struggles of the peoples of, the anti-colonial struggles against imperialism. And then obviously in the countries where imperialism is in control, formally or informally, they have to struggle against imperialism. So this tripartite division of the world is actually quite old and makes a lot of sense precisely again in that imperialist framework, which is the necessary framework for analyzing the international relations of the capitalist era. So I would say that, that would be my answer to those two questions. Or those would be my answers to those two questions.
Okay, let me just stop there because we've gone into our past our obligated time. Let's see if there are any questions, comments. Many people joined and then bailed. No questions, comments, brickbats. She has the orange Mussolini filter on. Yes, indeed. It is a funny kind of cast. I assume she's using incandescent light or something. Not everybody has, those whatever camera rings. Hearing no other questions, let me state that where we were is in terms of this little little project here is to
Jen, I'm going to just say something quickly on that front. One is that I think it's very important to understand by anti-imperialism a scientific analysis of the material history of the development and, most importantly, the underdevelopment of the world. And that there are many discourses on the left, including Marxist discourses, that are against forms of imperialism that, in my opinion, don't actually exist in the material world. And so when we're talking about imperialism, I take it in its most general sense, the underdevelopment of certain regions of the world for the development of others, and mainly for the lining of the pockets of the imperial ruling class. And that this is a long-standing project on the part of the imperial core and is very different than a special military.
let me, you can all go back to that. And he's quite a good speaker. I would say that Gabriel is quite a excellent character. He's done some other, there's other videos that are completely by him on this particular topic and on Losurdo. So you can, I will refer to that. I began today talking about Losurdo, a review, excuse me, by David Broder, done in 2017, and on Losurdo's work, which I've uploaded into Discord, so we can have that discussion. And then I started with the this particular completed, or we're almost complete. There's still another half hour on it, I think, of questions and comments. They already got to the audience Q&A. So I leave that to you to explore on your own. I would, hearing no other particular comments, let me stop share and